Welcome to Science Radio, a space where we chat about culture, belief, wellness, and current events, all through the lens of faith.
Welcome back to Science Radio. My name is Jesse, and today I am honoured, I am overjoyed to be joined by our editor-in-chief, our fearless leader, the man in the high tower himself, Mr. Jarrod Stackelroth. Jarrod, welcome to the podcast once again.
Thanks, Jesse, for having me. I don't know where to go after that introduction.
Oh, just so many places to go. I'm excited because today we are talking about an article that you wrote in June, this month's edition of Signs of the Times magazine. If you've picked up a magazine, by the time this has released, you may have already read it. And if so, I'm sure you'll be just as excited as us to talk more to Jarrod about where this idea came from. The article is called "The Tower Dedicated to Pride." If you have read it, then you'll know exactly where we're going. But Jarrod, for those of our readers who perhaps haven't gotten to the article yet, do you want to tell us a little bit about where the idea for this came from? Why were you so interested to talk about this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I don't really know, as in I don't remember exactly where I came across this article, but as an editor and as a magazine writer, I often am trawling through different news sites and reading stories about things, and I came across the story of the Tower of Jeddah. Now, Jeddah is a city in Saudi Arabia. It's a port and it's the entry to places like Mecca, which is one of the Islamic religion's most holy cities. So a lot of people travel through Jeddah to get there. And when we think of big developments, I guess, in the Middle East, we often think of Dubai and places like that, some of the stadiums that are getting built in Qatar for the upcoming World Cup. But in Jeddah, they were attempting to build the highest tower in the world. And something about it just captivated me, this idea of they're attempting to build this tower that's going to be 1 kilometer high. That was the plan, 1 kilometer into the air. I find that hard to even just sort of fathom a building that tall. And so part of it captivated me for that reason. But the other part was the parallels, I guess you could say, between this Bible story that I've been hearing since I was a young boy about the Tower of Babel. It was another tower that was supposed to reach heaven. It was supposed to be the tallest tower in the world and give the civilization access to the heavens, to become like gods in some way. And so they were trying to build this tower, and just the similarities struck me between the Tower of Jeddah in our modern, current Middle East, and the sort of ancient Tower of Babel and the story in the Bible that unpacks that.
I think the comparison to the Tower of Babel is quite apt, for one of the major reasons being the fact that the Jeddah Tower remains unfinished, at least as of the recording of this podcast. It was an ambitious project that I believe you say started in 2013, but it's 7, 8, 9 years later, and the tower remains unfinished. Why has it been so fraught with trouble, do you think?
Well, even Al Jazeera has reported that Saudi nationals have long complained of rampant corruption in the government and public funds being squandered or misused by those in power. So there's been some purges, Saudi Arabian purges, where even members of the royal family recently have been imprisoned. And some of those people were, I guess, drivers of this project. They wanted the project to happen. They were pushing the project, and it's pretty hard to finish a project when you're arrested and locked up. So that's part of the reason. And look, it has been taken on by other people, other companies. The developer is currently Thornton Tomasetti, and they seem to believe that the tower will be finished. They expect that it'll cost $1.2 billion. It'll be a luxury hotel, a whole shopping complex, and a big multi-use, multi-purpose rooms down the bottom. But yeah, there are a number of other issues that have obviously complicated actually getting it done. It's only about a third of the way done, apparently, as of, recording this podcast and writing the article. There didn't seem to be any movement on the horizon in terms of actually getting that project restarted.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the more recent photos of its progression in its development, it's hard to imagine the pre-visualization image that they're putting forth as this is what it's going to look like. It just looks like kind of an unsightly, ugly kind of building jutting out of the city skyline. But one of the interesting things that you talk about in your article, and you only briefly mention it, but I did want to dig into it a little bit, is the idea of kind of the future of skyscrapers being a little bit uncertain. Maybe not just skyscrapers, but high-density city dwellings. This obviously has been impacted by COVID-19, but what's the deal there?
Look, this was fascinating to me too. When I was researching the article, I found a really good BBC report, and obviously they've been referencing a book which is all about the future of skyscrapers. And there's apparently some architects and some architectural historians who are quite interested in some of these ideas. And basically, high density urban living is becoming less popular because of COVID-19, but also as remote working becomes easier and that sort of thing. And yet apparently they declared the death of skyscrapers after 9/11, September 11, the terrible event where those skyscrapers in New York got knocked over. But since then, they've actually had some of the tallest skyscrapers in the world completed in China. A number of cities in China continue to build these big high-rise buildings, apartment blocks, and industrial sort of work towers. So it's hard to say. There's often these trends. We heard that books would die because of television and radio, and sort of books are still with us. They've just found a different iteration. So I think these skyscrapers will continue to be among us and to be used and perhaps even to be built, but perhaps at less of a rate. There was a boom in the industry and that sort of seems to have slowed. And perhaps Jeddah is an example of that trend, part of this difficulty in getting these massive, monstrous buildings built.
There's two thoughts in my head. Number one seems to be the push toward high-density housing, which many people are touting as like this is going to help solve climate change and things like that. The fact of, let's put a lot of people all together in high-density housing. We live in Sydney. There are high-rises going up every other day. I mean, you live in one of them. Many people live in a high-rise complex these days. Close access to public transport, amenities, things like that. Makes sense in a big city. But then there's the other thing, which seems to be like the Jeddah Tower, like the Burj Khalifa, like so many of these big projects seem to be almost like ego projects, like for rich billionaires or multinational corporations, things like that. So I'm just wondering, like, we have two kind of worlds. On the one hand, we have this, let's try and minimize our carbon footprint. And on the other hand, let's maximize our carbon footprint and make this as luxurious and ostentatious and crazy as possible, almost like it's a competition of who can build the biggest tower, who can build the most crazy thing ever.
Yeah, look, certainly around my area, we've had a number of not high rises in that scale, but certainly apartment blocks, go up. And every time a house gets knocked down, they try and build either townhouses or high-rise apartments on it. I think COVID has changed people's minds. It certainly, for me, the idea of a little piece of land where I can at least build grow some vegetables, have some plants. To me, that seems more sustainable. Depending on, we're seeing the economy looking like tanking. We're seeing it's harder to get, cost of living, simple fruits and veggies. We've certainly indulged to excess in all the things that we've done in the past few years. And so, we're used to fruits and veggies all year round rather than eating seasonally. we're used to things because we've become so detached from, I guess, the circle of life, what grows in what season, and that we've become used to convenience and living on top of each other. And I think COVID-19 has gotten people tired of living on top of each other. I think it's made more people want to be self-sustaining. It doesn't necessarily bode well for the idea of these mega cities and, big, high population density places. It's become more and more attractive to find some land and get out of the city, get away from the craziness. And yet I always think, there is a human tendency, and the biblical authors were looking at this and wrestling with this, I think, with their Tower of Babel story. There is a human tendency to civilizing or coming together in cities and societies and communities and building, part of the lead up to the Tower of Babel story is about strong leaders, strong kings rising up and sort of gathering people to them. And part of that comes with the sort of intimation of exploitation and these rich sort of billionaires that you're talking about. Where have they made their money from? Well, it's not from giving handouts. It's not from helping, people to have a leg up or necessarily helping the environment. You could say it's possibly a bit exploitative, some of the practices that, have enabled people to get so much excess that they can build 1 kilometer towers in the sky. And so I think that's something that as a society, we're going to have to continue to wrestle with, that we can aim to do our best to leave, less of a carbon footprint, to be sustainable and to be more communal and sharing of our, goods and things that we grow and that sort of thing. We can give each other a leg up. But at the same time, there will always be a human tendency to strive to get ahead, to compete with everyone else, to gather as much wealth as I can. And in many instances, that will have to come through pushing down my fellow man. That's how it seems to happen in human nature. And I think that's a tendency that both the Bible rejects and we as, conscientious citizens, myself as a Christian, I should be looking at things that are exploitative and that are systems that take advantage of the disadvantaged. And I should reject that. I should rebel against that. And I think in some ways that's the moral of the story, both from Jeddah and from the Tower of Babel perspective. It seems like God wasn't happy to see these people exploit each other and build this giant tower and try and take the place of God in themselves to reach heaven or to build a high place, where they could reside and they could be kings among men. It seemed like that was part of the reason God said, no, you have to spread throughout the world. Because, for those that aren't as familiar with the story, basically this tower was attempting to be built by all of humanity, and God at that time mixed up the languages and had the people spread throughout the world. So it seems to be this idea that there can come great development, great leaps in human technology and information when people are all together, all on top of each other through civilization, etc. But there is also something to be said for diversifying, spreading out, and taking the simple life back, nomadic sort of moving through and populating the world and places in the world that aren't as high density. So it seems to be that tendency in the story. And it's just interesting that these guys have come along and decided we're going to build the highest tower in the world. We want to have that right, that privilege of calling ourselves the greatest, the tallest, the highest, and that their project has fallen through.
And I think it's that psyche that I want to dig into that I think is really, really interesting in this story. As you're speaking, it just reminded me of a TV show that I watched a few years ago called Altered Carbon, which is based on a book, a sci-fi book. And there's this picture in the opening episode of this detective who wakes up in this gritty, dark urban environment with people just living on top of each other. And he's transported via a cop car or whatever to the literal mansion in the clouds sort of thing. He goes from this high density urban environment where it's just dark and there's pollution, to the upper echelons of society that have built these towers that literally float in the heavens, sort of thing. They see the sun, they see the blue sky, whereas the poor, the oppressed, they only get to live in the dirt and the grime and the rain and the sludge. And I think that's a perfect sort of picture of what this dynamic is like. In a psychological sense, though, as well, it's not just about wealth and wealth inequality, which obviously is a big part of it. There seems to be something about human beings wanting to exploit each other so that they can reach a higher plane of existence, of using whatever wealth is available to us to reach that existence, whether it's Elon Musk trying to form a colony on Mars, or, you know, Jeff Bezos going into orbit just because he can, sort of thing. There seems to be this drive to reach heaven. And that's ultimately what the story of Babel is all about. And it's funny, when I was a kid, I just kind of thought, oh, wow, God really didn't like it because they stuck together and built a city. I was like, what's the big deal here? But then when you peel back the layers, there's something more going on here.
Babel throughout the Bible becomes this symbol of Babylon, the great city, you know, and Babylon is problematic to God and to his people, because in the story, literally, of the exile and things, Babylon is enslaving and exploiting Israel, God's chosen people. But they are also come to represent any sort of power that disadvantages and oppresses people. So, you know, when John is writing in the New Testament, one of the last books of the Bible, or the last book of the Bible in Revelation, it talks about Babylon a lot. But at that time, Babylon had sort of already fallen as an empire. But it's calling back to the Tower of Babel. It's calling back to what we know of Babylon throughout the biblical record. And he's probably having a sort of political swipe at the Roman Empire of the day by labeling Rome, or any power that exploits and oppresses and pushes people down, as Babylon. And so it's almost like that's what God is taking issue to. This Tower of Babel story is like an archetype for an oppressive, exploitative power right through the Bible. And the prophets, the biblical prophets, talk about how, as followers of God, we should stick up for the disadvantaged. We should take in the widow and the orphan. In those days, they didn't have the same social security type networks. And so people who were disadvantaged, they were really, you know, close to death's door. They had no support from their family. They had no support from the government or from anyone else. And so there was real emphasis on looking after those people. And so to me, it's like, well, human nature hasn't changed all that much. The world hasn't changed all that much. Instead of nations exploiting people, yeah, there probably are nations exploiting people. There probably are corrupt nations in the world. And yet a lot of it is these multinational corporations as well that you mentioned, you know, that have a lot of money, a lot of power over people's lives, the people working for them, the people who use their products. And there is some need for some of these corporations to keep people enslaved, as it were, to what their agenda is, so that they can become more rich and more powerful and more oppressive.
Yeah, that's such a I would say fascinating. It's such a depressing but true. It is true, and unfortunately, that's something that we have to deal with even today. Which is, I think, why the biblical stories, such as this one, they have echoes throughout all of human history. Because if John the Revelator can look at the Roman Empire and go, "Hey, this is a kind of Babylon," then, you know, that proves that it has staying power. Perhaps some of these stories are more circular in nature, that human nature is that predictable that we always have to keep a watch out for these sorts of tendencies, lest we become Babylon ourselves. I did want to ask you as well, I could resist, it fascinates me. The ancient Greeks had this idea of hubris, and many of our listeners will understand sort of what this is all about. But if you aren't familiar with this idea, there's many examples in ancient Greek and just stories in the ancient world, whether it be, Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to give it to humans and the gods punish him as a result of it, or whether it be, the ancients building the city of Atlantis, this great city, and apparently they disrespected the gods, and so the gods decided to destroy the city as a result. We even have stories of hubris in, our more modern myths, whether it be, like the Titanic. Some people say that, it was the sin that they declared it was an unsinkable ship that actually did it in the end. But do you think that this idea of hubris is something that features in this story? Is it an inversion? Is it sort of like a different take on it? What's your take on the hubris angle in the Tower of Babel?
Yeah, I mean, hubris is excessive pride or self-confidence. And I think the Greeks talked about it in their tragedies because they saw it in the psyche, the psychology of the people around them. We are all afflicted with the sin of self, I guess. And even in the biblical narrative, the idea of sin came from the idea of, now when we talk about sin, we're thinking of like a rebellion or a destruction. That's the idea that it's become associated with. But if you look at what happens to, say, introduce sin into the world, in some ways it's a trying to set yourself up in the place of God. That was what we talk about when we hear original sin or the fall, the idea that, Adam and Eve in the biblical narrative, the first humans were actually tempted to set themselves up in the place of God. And if we go back before that, the war in heaven, the idea of Lucifer, one of the prime angels, the prophets talk about him trying to set his throne up as high as the Most High. So in other words, taking the place of God once again. And I think in some ways, the Greeks had the idea of the divine punishing, and it's like a competition with the divine. And so it's the divine pushing back and trying to humble and push down people who try and get too big for themselves, tall poppy syndrome. If people are doing amazing feats, if people are doing great things, then they should be cut down to size. I don't think in my view of God, the God that I believe in, who respects free will and choice, who actually designed humans to develop and to grow, to spread and to multiply and to cultivate the world that he gave them, to work in the world that he gave them. I don't think the idea of having pride in our achievements is a problematic thing. I don't think that's a sin. I think setting ourselves up in the place of God, or deciding that we don't actually need God or the divine, or that, the pride or the arrogance that we can know everything, we can do everything, we can achieve everything, and there's nothing that can be unknown or mysterious to us. I think that's the problem, that we set ourselves up for the fall. I don't think God punishes as such as a, lightning bolt from the heavens and just says, hey, you've got to be cut down to size. I think it's more a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, that as we try and strive to be like God, we actually fall short. And I think that, my evidence for this is that God actually, through the biblical narrative, he reverses the curse of Babel. In Pentecost, in Acts, he brings people together from all nations of the world, and they are all understanding the gospel message in their own language. And so he's bringing people from multicultural, from all the nations. And in Revelation, we get this picture of the tree of life and the leaves and the fruit of the tree of life for the healing of the nations. We get this picture of a human city like Babel, but where people collaborate, cooperate, where their culture and stuff is to lift one another up. And so I like the idea, coming back to what we were talking about the exploitation and oppression and stuff. I think if anything, that's what God was having issue with. If he stepped in to stop that from happening. That's why, because people were being hurt, people were being exploited. And so the biblical story arc calls people back to restoration. God wants to see people in a place where they can live together in harmony, where they can, no more crying, no more death. We hear about these things. God's original plan for humans was to live and to have life and to cultivate the ground and to develop. And I think that some of those concepts are really beautiful and should be striven for,
No, that's really cool. And I think that's a good place to leave it off, because I think there's more to unpack, but I'd love for people to go and read the article for themselves. But thank you for painting that picture for us, Jarrod. I especially love how it's not just that God doesn't want to just cut us down to size. He doesn't want to just bring us back or to humble us, but he actually wants us to experience rich, fulfilling life in him. And that's ultimately where he's bringing all of us as humanity. So thank you for the article, sir. Thank you for chatting with us. If you'd like to read the article, you can do in the June issue of Signs of the Times magazine. Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
This episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A print subscription is $28 a year, or just $14 for a digital subscription. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.